As Eric mentioned, it took a lot of collaboration to bring Letitia here, and it is such an honor for us to have her. I first had the pleasure of meeting her when we were both in graduate school. I was attending Texas Women's University, and she was across town in Denton, Texas at University of North Texas. These are sister institutions, and so you could take courses back and forth. I've always been drawn to her work, being a photographic artist that also works as textiles. She's inspired me throughout the years, and so it's always a pleasure when I have a chance to see what new work she's creating, and in this case, to bring her to campus so that she can share her work with you firsthand. Letitia received her BA in journalism from the University of Oklahoma, and then went on to receive a BFA in photography from the Art Institute of Boston at Lesley, and then she completed her MFA in photography at the University of North Texas. This is an amazing artist who's received many accolades throughout her career so far and has much more to do, I'm sure. Her work has been featured and exhibited in Art Prize in Grand Rapids, Michigan. If you haven't heard of Art Prize, this is a really big up-and-coming contemporary art annual art exhibition with a huge prize at the end. She has also been exhibited in the Contemporary Art Center in New Orleans, the McKenna Museum of African American Art, and Project Row Houses during PhotoFest in Houston, Texas. She's represented by Liliana Block Gallery in Dallas. And these are just a few of the many accomplishments she's already received so far. So please join me in welcoming Letitia.
No, this is okay. Can everybody see the screen all right?
Yeah.
Can everyone hear me in the back? Is this a good projection level? Hi. Hi. I'm really glad to be here. I'm honored and appreciate the warm and very gracious introduction, and Morgan for bringing me here. And it's been a lovely stay. This is my first time in Kansas, but I went to high school and my first college degree in Oklahoma, so I'm kind of used to planes. But it was really a nice drive up, and I'm enjoying my stay here. I'm going to try to go through this PowerPoint at a little tick-tock pace because I know you guys only have so much time here. I have 4 bodies of work that I would like to show you, and the last one is what I'm currently working on now and is not supposed to be finished until 2020, so you'll get to hear a little bit about a project that I'm still sort of working through. So probably over 20 years ago, I wrote this poem before actually I started my first photography degree. So, but I feel like this poem has a lot to do with where my work is now. My work is heavily rooted in the Deep South. My mother was from Louisiana, or is from Louisiana. My father was from Mississippi. And I grew up an Army brat, so the only time we went there was on vacations. My father was stationed mostly in Germany, so it was a very big jump to go from a European country and then find yourself traveling in the Deep South. You know, it's like its own country by itself. But I wrote this, and all the females listed are the descendants to me, and then my 2 daughters are last. But I'll just, if you'll humor me, I'll read it to you. Dusty roads, heavy, humid heat, swamps and overgrowth everywhere you look. The moisture never quite leaves your body when you get out of the tub. You breathe in the red dirt when trucks fly by and wait for the dust to clear as light streams through the trees above. It's easier to walk the winding road to the store on the hill than to try to pile 8 or 10 kids in the car, all screaming for chips and soda pop. If I open my mouth to speak, I'm surrounded with questions of places far from here. It's funny because I feel I've stepped into a history book. Slave quarters still in use, plantations are now antebellum homes, and the French I worked so hard to learn in school flows like water here. I can't help but think of my female ancestors and wonder what kind of life they had in the backwoods of Louisiana, what dreams they had as they strode down this same dusty road, breathing in the sweet smell of red clay after a brief summer rain, catching a light breeze through the willow and magnolia trees, and licking the moisture off their lips to temper a thirst till they made it to the store on the hill. So this body of work The first one that I'm showing you is called LA 19. And LA 19 is the Louisiana Highway 19 that runs out of Baton Rouge North. And most of my family lives somewhere along that highway. And so I did this project, and all of these images were printed onto silk dupioni fabric, and then the images were cut up and hand stitched back together with other heirloom fabrics and framed in a bunch of mismatched frames. I was really inspired by old masters paintings, and so I wanted to take the image of where I was from and turn it into something more grand. So when you see these pieces in person, because of the silk and the quality of the sheen of that fabric, they have a slightly elevated look to them. But all the framing in this body of work is different. This is my grandmother's house. This was an image taken during a funeral procession. This is my great aunt, who was a domestic, and one of the families that she worked for had a painter in the family, and he did this portrait of her, and she didn't like it, and it stayed in a closet until she passed away. And after she passed, they gave it to me because they figured only an artist could appreciate this thing, so you take it with you. And I photographed it and reprinted it out and made this piece. This is a cousin. This is my grandfather, and it's printed on a pillowcase. It was right before he passed away. The area where my grandmother, my great-grandmother, and my great-aunt lived is kind of like a little compound. And when I took this picture, I was actually standing outside the window of my grandmother's house, but you can see her mother's house reflected in the glass. It was during that time of day where the sun's going down, and photographers call it sweet light. And so it's really pretty, and you can see into the window, but you can also see nature and my great-grandmother's house reflected in the glass. So I consider myself mostly a documentary photographer, so each one is its own image, and then I alter it and do other things to it. This is my mother. It's called morning meditation. She doesn't get out of the bed until she finishes her meditations in the morning. She doesn't have quite that many crosses. I added more for effect. This is a cousin, and he's stripping wire to fill the copper on the inside to raise money under the tree. And anybody who has family from the country knows there's always a tree that certain family members like to hang out underneath and get in trouble. Usually a lot of drinking and smoking and cursing going on under the tree. But at least he's doing some work. This is at my great aunt's funeral, and that's my grandmother that's in the center that's being consoled there. Little shed and a clothesline. One of my cousins and her 3 girls. And I really like this image because I feel like the painting at the top is an interesting juxtaposition. You have this idealized image of family above, and then the reality of her situation where she's a single mom with 3 girls and just making it, And this is my altarpiece that I made of my grandmother sitting on her favorite spot on the couch and flanking on both sides. I had seen a show at Southern Methodist University at the Meadows Museum where they brought in all these old Italian altarpieces, and they're sort of like quilted frames together that make up the story out of the Bible. So you have all these different scenes out of the Bible, and I was trying to make my own Louisiana version of that. So the images on the side, which you'll see this one come up again, are things that as a child, when we would be driving out into the country to visit family, would tell me how close we were getting to my grandmother's house. I'm sure everybody can relate to traveling to your grandma's house, and there's certain things you see. You don't know the street names, and you don't know the highway name, but you see that one ice cream shop, and you know you're getting close. It was that kind of thing. So I always looked for this field. It used to be hundreds of goats that were in this field when I was a kid. And when I went by once, it was down to this one last white goat. And now if you went by there, it's completely overgrown because the landscape in Louisiana takes over everything if you're not mowing it or goats are eating it. And then there was also this tree in this junkyard that was covered with moss, and I always thought that moss was the most beautiful thing, to see it dripping out of a tree, and they don't have it in Germany, so it was sort of romantic to me, the idea of a tree covered in moss in an old junkyard. So this second body of work is called Bayou Baroque, and I was flying to New Orleans, and the gentleman sitting next to me on the plane worked in construction, and he was kind of chatty, and he started telling me about the work he'd done in New Orleans after Katrina, and he had helped to restore an old mother house, which is where the retired nuns live. And he was talking about this order of nuns in New Orleans and the area of the city where it was, and you know, my mind started ticking, and I'm thinking, I don't remember ever seeing nuns in that part of the city. What is he talking about? But there is an order called Sisters of the Holy Family, and it's an order of African American nuns that started right at the end of slavery. And the way they started, there was their foundress, Henrietta DeLille, a Creole woman, did not want to go through the ball system, where these women would be paired up with wealthy plantation owners who had land outside the city, but they would take on a Creole woman as a sort of city wife, even though they were not legally married. And they would put this woman up in a little cottage in the quarter, and they would have children, and the children would go to Paris and study and all this kind of stuff, but the man was free to leave whenever he wanted to, if it got boring for him, or he just decided he didn't want to do that anymore. And her sister and her mother had gone through that process, and she decided she didn't want to live that life, so she started this order of nuns. And so I contacted them and asked if I could come and take pictures, and I don't know if any of you have ever hung out with nuns before, but they're not really nice people. I think they thought that I was going to be doing sort of like JCPenney style portraits that they could then pass out to their family and friends. So I got a lot of, well, Sister Bertha. Sister Bertha was the most difficult woman I had to work with during the shoot. She walked into the space, and I had like bed sheets hanging up all over the place and all these lights, and she was like, "What's going on here? What are you doing?" And I explained to her my process. "Oh, I'm just working on this project, and blah, 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 blah. You don't have to do it if you don't want to." And she's like, "I don't." And I was like, "Okay." And she walked out. And then when I got up off the floor, she walked back in and sat down in the chair and didn't say a word. And I thought, dear God, let me take this picture before this woman goes off on me again. So Sister Bertha came back in, but I think it's because she had a lazy eye on the right side, and so she was a little self-conscious about that. So I stayed there for the whole day, and they would come in, and I would take their picture, and I did send them some little 5x7 prints back, and they were very appreciative. This is a set of twins that joined together, and since then one of the sisters has passed, but they were so cute because they came in holding hands, kind of hunched over, and sat across from each other and let me take their picture. And all of my work is printed on fabric. It's hard to tell maybe in these images. I don't know if you can see like sticky and things, but this piece in the background is actually a photograph I took of, for lack of a better word, a certificate that it dates back from the 1800s of a nun. She is dedicating her life to Christ, and it's almost like a marriage license. but it's very ornate, and there's a family who collects my husband's work that had one of these in their home, and they let me take a picture of it and use it in this piece as long as I didn't tell anybody where I had seen it. A lot of times when I'm stitching, I like quilting patterns, and particularly patterns that are African American historical patterns, so things like housetops, or this is considered like strips and bars kind of pattern. I was lucky enough to go and sit with and learn from some of the quilters at G's Ben, if you've ever seen any of their quilts. And so it's either I'm quilting them or I'm just trying to hook the image back together. Along with this body of work, she's the only one that's not a retired nun. This particular image here, she was a novitiate and just getting ready to receive her official name. And they have told me that I can come back and take pictures. So the next phase of this, I'd like to go and focus on the women that are just joining, just committing their lives to this life. There's my white goat again. This image had such a spiritual feel to me that it just felt right. And some of the rest of the body that I haven't shown you had to do with flowers that are native to Louisiana. I printed these images of flowers onto bath salts bags, way, way before you people were born. Salt and sugar and flour and all of your products like that used to come in these pretty little cotton bags. And women would collect them and make clothes for their children. So if the husband was going into the store to pick up some flour, the wife would say, okay, I need like 5 more sacks of this pattern. And then he'd come back with the green floral pattern, and she'd make dresses and shorts and stuff for the kids. And you could still get stuff like that. But when my mother was growing up, that's the only thing they bought from the store. Everything else they killed or grew themselves. And she was telling me about all this, and so I was really influenced by those floral patterns and the resourcefulness of women to take what looks like it's scraps and turn it into something more beautiful. And so I printed images of the flowers onto these bath salt bags and embroidered anything that was like clean or water text on the bag with red thread. All of my work stems from my faith, my family, or my cultural heritage. And so there's always these little links to my faith in the work. So for me, the red of the water has to do with Jesus and the blood and all of that. And this had a very strong spiritual feel to me. So this was sort of the centerpiece for this show. It's 120 inches tall, so it's almost the size of this back here. It's pretty big. So this third project, let's see what time it is called 40 Acres Gambo Ya. In Louisiana, Gambo Ya is when everybody's talking at once and nobody's really paying attention, like when you're cooking gumbo and you just throw a bunch of stuff in the pot. It's like Gambo Ya. Everybody's talking and nobody's really listening. And the 40 acres references the promise of 40 acres and a mule to newly freed African American slaves. There were some people who did receive their 40 acres. Some people were able to keep it, and some people had theirs taken away. But in this project, I'm really looking at African American land wealth, or the lack thereof. The fact that if we've had land, a lot of times we often sell it off for the money, and there's not land to pass down like some other cultures have, where it's like, oh, my family's lived on this property for hundreds of years or whatever, So when I was going through, this is a very broad look at it, because now I'm getting ready to focus a little bit more. But in this first phase, I was looking at land that I particularly had a tie to, or land that my family was slaves on, or land that today has that same kind of feel, you know, the same sort of oppression to African Americans. So this is, again, my grandmother's house. And the works are printed on fabric, and they're framed in vintage embroidery hoops. And I chose embroidery hoops because when a woman sits down to embroider something, she's generally creating something that she wants to pass down. It's something precious. She's not going to use it for her dish towel, right? It's going to be something precious that she's hoping will last through the generations, and it's usually done with a lot of love. And so I thought there was an interesting contrast between the images and then this idea of them being precious in these embroidery hoops. It's an old church. They still have service in this church. It's the Bayou. It's called Bayou Baroque, and it's just west of New Orleans, down on the coast, and a large minority population there, but they're really working hard on the coast of Louisiana to sort of build back up the coast. So I volunteered to plant reed grasses, and you literally like wade out into the swamp and push grass down in the muck. And because the river used to move, you know, rivers used to move, but once we started building up buildings and stuff, it kind of stopped things from being able to fluctuate. But when it would move, it would drop sediment in different areas, and it would cause the vegetation to be really fertile. Well, since it's not moving anymore, the vegetation isn't getting what it's needing. Of course, the way we treat the land is causing problems with the plant growth. And when you don't have that buffer, when the hurricanes come in, it causes more damage. There's nothing to kind of slow those winds down as they're moving inland. So now they're going out and they're planting reed grasses, and they're dumping like oyster shells to encourage other oysters to come and build up the under the water areas, the reef-like areas. So I volunteered to go out and plant reed grass, and those are the bags on the bank there, what we would be dragging through the water. And then I took an underwater camera and photographed too, where you can see the grasses from a different angle. This is my cousin Bud's house. I'm not very good with titles, so it's called Bud's house. But his name is Bud, and he likes to drink Bud. And so there you have Bud's house. But that's, I jest, but that's another issue with African American land wealth and what it looks like when we actually own some land and how it's being taken care of. It's a serious problem in our community. I'll try to pick it up a little bit. I will say this one was taken on a correctional property. I see a strong connection between slavery and incarceration. We won't get into all that, we don't have time right now, but I was driving past and I saw these cows, and I did not ask for permission to take a picture. I just jumped out of my car and ran over, and the cows knew that this was a very important moment, so they all lined up and faced me, and I took the shot. And my mother was in the car yelling, "Get out of this car! We're gonna get thrown in jail!" But it's one of my favorite images in this body of work, and I think it's because they're black cows with white faces, and it's on a prison. And the prison runs a large farm, which has pecan orchards, and obviously these cattle, and it's the inmates that are doing all the work. So when you drive by and they're out working in the fields, it looks like a slave plantation, you know. I'll just click through these. I want to get to this last. This is a cotton field in the spring. It gets pretty flowers on it in Mississippi. This is shooting into the Mississippi River. These are old slave quarters that squatters are basically living in. It doesn't have any water, it doesn't have any electricity. You can see the way they're all lined up. If you've ever been on one of those plantations where they show you how they used to be, this is exactly how it was. And it's in Greenwood, Mississippi. There's a cemetery that's overgrown. It's a sharecropper's duplex on the side of a sugarcane field, and it had 2 families that used to live in this little shack here. And there's a sugarcane. This is the property where my mother's family was enslaved on my mom's side. And if you think back to the poem, that first name was Sally. She was the last enslaved person on my family side. And the next name down was Lydia. She was the daughter of a slave owner. And he left the land to her. And generations later, my mom's generation sold it off. But the man who owns it will still let us come on the property because there's a family cemetery there. So I took that on that property. This is the only image in Texas. So when I do my presentations in Texas, they're always like, how come your work doesn't? I live in Texas. They're like, why don't you ever do anything about Texas? So I throw this one in, I'm like, there you go, Texas. Don't ask me why I haven't done any work in Texas. This is when they just stocked a pond behind my mom's house. These are actually like, what do you call baby catfish? What's the word? I forget what you call it, but that's all the baby catfish when they first stocked the pond. And I thought they looked like a really big catfish. And then you gotta have a mule. Talking about 40 acres and a mule. And this particular mule will become famous soon because he's been bought by some production company. I guess it's rare to have a mule that's mixed with an Appaloosa horse, But his name is Harley, and he's a real sweet mule. Side note, I didn't know until I started this project that mules can't reproduce. Did anybody else know? Is that not the craziest thing you've ever heard in your life? They cannot reproduce. It's something about chromosomes. A horse has got so many, and a donkey's got so many, and then the mule ends up with odd chromosome numbers. So a mule and a mule can't have a baby. That's just ridiculous. Anyways, that's another project at some other time. So what am I doing today? I'm doing this project that's based on the word suffrage. And right now it's loosely called Suffer Rage. And like I said, this project's not supposed to be done until 2020. So everything I tell you right now could change because I'm still working on it. But what I've been doing is partnering with other female artists of color. And I send them a protest sign and I say, create a piece based on your understanding of the word suffrage, which you see the definitions there. And I don't see their piece until I photograph them. But this started during, I don't know if this is going to work, we'll try it. But this started during a residency I did in Tuscany. I don't think you can hear it. Wait, maybe can you hear that? Yes, birds. It's usually much louder than this, but it's hard to hear. Anyways, so I did, just pretend like you hear a bunch of birds, doves, and all kinds of stuff. I did this residency in Tuscany, and they just invited us to come, and it was a residency for faith-based artists. And they said, well, just come. If you make work, great. If you don't, great. We just want you to experience Italy and see how it affects your work. And so I didn't know what I was going to do, because as you can see, all my work is based on Mississippi and Louisiana. They don't have nothing look like Mississippi and Louisiana in Tuscany. But every morning I was staying on this, they have like an olive farm in a villa, and every morning the birds would wake me up. And it was just so wonderful to me. I said, okay, every time the birds wake me up, I'm gonna get up, I'm gonna go up on the roof, and I'm gonna make 3 minutes recording of the birds. And I didn't know what I was gonna do with it. I come back to the States, and I'm trying to research what these birds are, and I contact, bird specialists in Texas, and they're like, well, really, you need to talk to somebody in Tuscany, because I'm a specialist with Texan birds. So that didn't take me very far, but I came across this website where they're trying to record the sounds of female songbirds. Like most of the scientific recordings of songbirds are male birds. And so now they're in a rush to try to record female songbirds. And I was like, really? Birds too? You're not even going to listen to the women? Birds. So that sparked this whole project where I started partnering with these women. And this is the piece that I made first. It's the image of my daughter. She's 10. And she's holding a sign that says, enough. And it's printed on a 6-foot cotton picking sack. The sacks they would drag through the fields and put the cotton in, right? Her pose is referencing the Norman Rockwell painting, The Problem We All Live With, if you've ever seen that, where it's the little girl who's going to school for desegregation, and she's got like some police officers leading her along the way. And then the phrase enough comes from the March for Our Lives rally that happened in DC after the shooting in Florida. Martin Luther King's granddaughter spoke, who was 9, and she said, I have a dream, enough is enough, talking about the violence in the school. So for me, this piece touches on slavery, it touches on civil rights, and it brings it forward to today. So that one's mine. This is Andrea Tosca, and she had just read the life story of George Washington Carver, who I believe is from Kansas. So maybe you guys have studied him. But she was really sort of moved by the fact that he didn't want to sell his intellectual property. There were many companies that came to him, offered him millions of dollars, and he said, no, I want to teach this to my community. And so she made her sign, we are like mushrooms, weeds, so make room and sleep. And that's printed on one of those pretty flour sacks I was talking about that happens way before y'all were born. This is Vicki Mink, and she made her sign using phrases from powerful women of the past, and this is printed on a sugar sack, so sugar would have come in one of these bags. This is Jessica Bell. She teaches at Booker T. Washington in Dallas, and she's biracial. And so her sign really had to do with, how certain times she's seen as one culture and other times she's seen as something else, and sort of walking that line in our society of, which way do you go? How do you present yourself? If her hair is curly, then she gets treated one way. If her hair is straight, then she gets treated another. This is Valerie Gillespie, and she teaches at a private school in Dallas, teaches middle school students, and that's her daughter with her. Her sign was basically about voice. It's Kiana Martin. She's a little bit more violent. Okay. And then I'm going to click through so that you guys can ask some questions if you want to. I'm going to skip over this next part and just say that as part of this project, the women and I are also planning to make t-shirts and sell the money to either be a scholarship fund for some kick-ass female artist or a political science student. And this is the second phase of the logo. I don't know where it's going to go, but it's Suffer Rage. And the bird is a black Jacobin, which is a hummingbird that has the loudest, highest frequency song of any bird in the world. And it's so loud you can't hear it unless you record it. So you have to go to great lengths in order to hear what this particular bird has to say. And I just like that in comparison with a project about women's voice. So that was really fast. But it's 3:42, and I know you guys have to be out of here at what, 3:50? So if anybody has any questions, yes ma'am.
I see you're including the bird in the slogan here, but are you planning to include those birds in more of your projects for this piece?
I might, I mentioned that this project is still ongoing, so I've got like stuff stuck in my head that I don't know how it's going to come out. I was thinking of embroidering the birds, because once I take the image of the women, then it becomes mine. I put it on a sack, I can do whatever I want with it. I can embroider into that sack. I've been thinking about that poem, What a Little Girl's Made Of, sugar and spice and everything nice, and how that works with whatever the women are saying. So I do want to see this come up again. I just don't know what form it's going to be, so that it all kind of ties together. Yeah.
What does your family think about the purchase of their homes and stuff like that?
They're really sort of laid back. It's just they've accepted that that's who I am. That's what I do, and so they sort of ignore me. But when I have shows in Louisiana, they will come. And then it's kind of funny, like my grandmother has since passed, but I had a show she came to, and the pieces of her were in it. So then people were like, oh, can you stand here and let me take your picture? And you would have thought she was a celebrity. It wasn't even about me anymore, it was her show. So, but they're really supportive, yeah. Let me get this.
Do you do your quilting by hand or by machine?
By hand. I have a machine, but it's sculpture in my studio. I don't know how to use a machine, and I've just been teaching myself by hand. My goal is to get this thing to stick to that thing, so.
You said you were making t-shirts for those. If we wanted to purchase one of those, where would we possibly be able to have access to that?
Probably if you follow me on Instagram, then I'll probably be making some announcement about that on there. We're going to sell them for sure at the gallery that she mentioned, Liliana Block in Dallas, when we have the opening, and I want the women to all wear the shirt there. I want it to be very political, because this 2020, as you probably already know, is the centennial for the women's right to vote. It's a big political year for us, so I'm thinking these t-shirts, all the women wear them, we're there, we sell them, and then raise money for some really kicking it suffrage scholarship fund. Anybody else?
The signs of the people we're holding, did you make the signs or did the people make the signs?
The people made the signs, and when I photograph them, they leave them with me. So hopefully when we have the show, they'll become an installation in the space. And I don't know how that's going to work out yet, but in my mind, I'm picturing them somehow freestanding in the floor where people can move in and out of them, but we haven't really resolved all of that yet, so everything I'm saying could change. Yeah.
On your quilted pieces, what's the significance to you of taking portions of the pictures apart and then putting them back together?
I think it's because of the quilt. The idea of taking something that was a scrap and rearranging it in a different way, because those women would start with an old shirt or some jeans or a towel or something and cut it up and then re-stitch it back together. And then also with a quilt, it says something about comfort and home, and lots of people can relate to it. So I like that. It's like a bridge between me and the viewer. When they come to the show, I get people a lot of times saying, oh, this reminds me of my great aunt's house or my grandma's. Even if they're not African American, they can still relate to the work, because most of us have had quilts or something, and it's like a nice bridge. Yeah. Anybody else? Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, what does it mean to you as an African American woman to actually be able to tell that story all the way back from slavery and to incorporate your family as well, and then to come forward to the 21st century and see, us going through the things that we're going through and still just fighting for equality? What does that mean to you?
Well, I think that's how this suffrage project really kind of got birthed out, because I've been working on my own history for so long, and it seems like the difficulties that they had back in the day have just either shifted a little bit or they're just continuing. And it's really frustrating, but I think art is a language, and this is my way of talking about all of that stuff, and I'm glad to be able to do it and present it in a way that's not aggressive, but is accessible and can open up a dialogue without it becoming a hostile situation, you know? And so I think that's really my role, is to let's talk about these things and come from a place of beauty, hopefully, and that way we can go deeper than if it's just this aggressive kind of sensationalist thing, you know? Anybody else? Okay,
Is there
well,
a reason why you took more pictures of the women in your family opposed to like the men?
there's a lot of men in the room.
What were you?
You know, I'm really.
I mean, I like it. I love the strong black woman narrative.
Yeah. We had very strong matriarch in my family, and my family is predominantly female until you get to my generation. Then we have more boys being born. But when I was growing up, it's heavily, like all of my cousins for the most part were female, and a lot of aunts, and I'm always interested in women's stories. Very intrigued by women and how resourceful they are. And in our culture, there's a lot of that. And I think that, this is going to get long, but I think that stems from slavery and the separation of the family, and that shifted the way we interact with each other as families. So we have a lot of families that are matriarch driven in African American culture. And so I think that that's what sort of is pushing me with that. Sort of quick, but does that make, yeah. All right, well, it's time for y'all to go to your next class.